My name is Marcus Richardson, and at 29 years old I thought I had finally built something meaningful for myself in Austin, Texas. That modest 1,200 square foot house in East Austin represented every sacrifice, every extra shift, every weekend spent working instead of relaxing that I'd made over the years. Meanwhile, my younger brother Dylan seemed to drift through life like a leaf on water, carried along by our parents' endless stream of financial support and emotional accommodation. I never could have imagined that they would have the sheer audacity to show up at my front door one Thursday evening with Dylan in tow, casually announcing that he'd be moving in temporarily to get back on his feet, without even the basic courtesy of asking for my permission first. The absolute shock and confusion on all three of their faces when I calmly informed them that I had sold the house 3 months earlier and moved to a completely different part of town was worth every sleepless night I had spent meticulously planning my escape from their toxic family dynamics. If you're reading this story, please drop a comment telling me where you're from and whether you've had to deal with similar golden child versus scapegoat dynamics in your own family. Hit that upvote button if you believe that standing up for yourself and establishing healthy boundaries is worth whatever fallout might follow. Growing up in the manicured suburbs of Richardson, Texas, just outside Dallas, I learned from an extremely early age that love, attention, and resources in the Richardson household came with very specific conditions attached. Our split-level home on Maple Street had 3 bedrooms, a 2-car garage, perfectly maintained landscaping, and the appearance of suburban normalcy that my parents worked so hard to project to the outside world. But somehow, despite having adequate space and resources for 2 children, only one child ever seemed to truly matter or occupy our parents' sustained attention and concern. Dylan, who was 4 years younger than me, was born with what my mother consistently described as special sensitivity and what my father called an artistic temperament. What I eventually came to recognize after years of therapy and painful self-reflection was that these were just elaborate euphemisms for a free pass to avoid consequences, responsibility, or any real expectations for mature behavior. From the moment Dylan could walk and talk, he seemed to understand instinctively that tears, tantrums, and claims of being overwhelmed or misunderstood would immediately mobilize both parents to solve whatever problem he was facing, while my own needs and struggles were met with expectations of independence and self-reliance. The fundamental pattern that would define our entire childhood and follow us well into adulthood established itself clearly when I was 12 and Dylan was 8. I had spent the entire summer working odd jobs around our neighborhood, mowing lawns in the scorching Texas heat, pulling weeds from flower beds, washing cars in driveways, and cleaning out garages. Every single dollar went into a coffee can I kept hidden in my bedroom closet, because I had fallen in love with a skateboard I'd seen at the local sporting goods store. $47.63 represented an enormous sum to me at that age, earned through countless early mornings and sweat-soaked afternoons, pushing our neighbor Mrs. Henderson's ancient, barely functional mower across her uneven lawn. The day I finally had enough money saved, I convinced my mother to take Dylan and me to the sporting goods store. I had been talking about this skateboard for months, showing them the advertisement I'd cut out from a magazine, explaining exactly which model I wanted and why. When we got to the store, I carefully counted out my crumpled bills and handful of quarters while the cashier waited patiently. But just as I was about to complete the purchase, Dylan threw one of his spectacular tantrums right there in the middle of the store. "It's not fair," he wailed, tears streaming down his face with a dramatic flair that never failed to get results. "Why does Marcus get a skateboard and I don't? We're supposed to share everything. He's being mean to me." Within minutes, and I'm not exaggerating here, my mother was explaining to the confused cashier that we'd actually be taking 2 identical skateboards, using money from what she called the emergency fund, that apparently materialized whenever Dylan wanted something. She handed over her credit card, while giving me a look that clearly communicated I was expected to be grateful for her generosity, and to share my hard-earned skateboard with my brother. Dylan's skateboard, purchased with 0 effort or sacrifice on his part, lasted exactly 3 weeks before he abandoned it completely in favor of soccer, claiming that skateboarding was too hard and hurt his knees. My skateboard, the one I had worked all summer to earn, became my primary mode of transportation for the next 4 years and remained one of my most treasured possessions throughout high school. This pattern repeated itself constantly throughout our childhood, but I was too young and too indoctrinated into the family system to recognize it as fundamentally unfair. When Dylan struggled with reading in elementary school, our parents immediately arranged for expensive tutoring sessions and had him tested for learning disabilities. When I struggled with math in 5th grade, I was told to work harder and ask the teacher for help. When Dylan wanted to quit piano lessons after 2 months because they were boring, our parents let him switch to drums, then guitar, then back to piano, buying whatever instruments his fleeting interests required. When I expressed interest in learning the violin, I was told that we couldn't afford another instrument right now, and maybe I should focus on sports instead. School events and achievements followed the same predictable patterns that left me feeling invisible and unimportant. During my 4 years on the high school cross-country team, my parents attended exactly one meet, arriving 45 minutes late because Dylan had a stomachache and needed special attention before they could leave the house. They left during the third event because Dylan was bored and wanted to go home. When I qualified for the state championship meet during my senior year, an achievement that represented years of early morning training runs and weekend competitions, they were in San Antonio watching Dylan's middle school science fair, where his volcano project, which had been primarily researched, designed, and built by our father during late-night garage sessions, won second place. My race at the state championship earned a small mention in our local newspaper, which neither parent bothered to read or save. Dylan's science fair ribbon was framed and hung prominently in the hallway where every visitor would see it. Dylan's academic struggles became the central organizing principle of our entire household throughout his middle and high school years. Professional tutors appeared regularly at our kitchen table, charging $75 per hour to help him scrape by with C's and D's in classes that I was managing to ace through independent study and natural aptitude. Our dinner conversations revolved around Dylan's assignments, his test anxiety, his conflicts with teachers who didn't understand his learning style. Meanwhile, I maintained a 3.8 GPA, scored in the 95th percentile on standardized tests, and earned recognition in academic honor societies. Achievements that were acknowledged with brief, good job comments before the conversation inevitably returned to Dylan's needs. When college application season arrived during my senior year, the disparity in treatment became even more glaring and impossible to ignore. My parents spent months researching colleges and programs that would accommodate Dylan's learning differences, even though he was still in middle school at the time. They subscribed to multiple college planning services, hired a private counselor to help him develop an academic success strategy, and began planning campus visits to schools with strong support programs for students with learning disabilities. For me, they handed me a thick stack of financial aid forms with the comment, "You're smart enough to figure this out on your own, Marcus. We have confidence in your abilities." The message was clear. Dylan needed help and support to succeed, while I was expected to navigate the complex world of college applications, scholarships, and financial aid entirely independently. The University of Texas at Austin accepted me with partial academic merit aid based on my test scores and GPA, but the remaining costs still represented a significant financial burden. The total expense required a complex combination of federal student loans, work-study programs, and a part-time job at a campus coffee shop that had me getting up at 4:30 a.m. every weekday to open the store before my first class. I survived on ramen noodles, free office snacks from campus events, and the occasional meal purchased with my employee discount at the coffee shop. My daily schedule during college was absolutely brutal but necessary. Wake up at 4:15 a.m., shower, grab a protein bar, and bike to the coffee shop to open at 5:30 a.m. Work until 8:30 a.m., then bike directly to my first class, often arriving with coffee stains on my shirt and exhaustion already setting in. Classes until 3 p.m., then either work-study in the computer lab or head to my evening shift at a campus tutoring center. Homework and studying happened late at night in my tiny dorm room, often until 1 or 2 a.m. before I had to start the cycle all over again. Despite this punishing schedule, I graduated in exactly 4 years with a degree in computer science and a cumulative debt of $31,000. I was proud of that debt, actually, because I knew I had earned every penny through my own effort and sacrifice. Meanwhile, Dylan attended a small private college in East Texas called Henderson University, with every expense fully covered by our parents' generosity. They paid his tuition, his room and board, his meal plan, his textbooks, his car payment, his car insurance, his cell phone bill, and even gave him a monthly allowance for entertainment and miscellaneous expenses. During Dylan's 6 years in college, it took him an extra 2 years to graduate because he changed majors 3 times and took a semester off to find himself. He switched from business to communications to art history, and finally back to communications. Our parents not only supported these changes financially, but actively encouraged them, telling him that it was important to follow his passion and not rush into anything that didn't feel right. They paid for his apartment off campus when he decided the dorms were too social and interfered with his studies. They bought him a brand new car when his used one broke down. They even funded his spring break trips to Cancun and Colorado because, according to my mother, all college students need opportunities to decompress and socialize. Dylan also required therapy throughout college for what our parents described as adjustment difficulties and anxiety related to academic pressure. They paid for weekly sessions with a private therapist, covered the cost of prescription medications, and even arranged for him to have extended time on exams and assignments through the school's disability services office. When he struggled with a particularly challenging class, they hired private tutors. When he had conflicts with roommates, they helped him find new living arrangements. When he felt overwhelmed by course loads, they negotiated with his academic advisor to reduce his credit hours. The contrast in treatment was so stark that I sometimes wondered if I had been adopted, but I looked too much like both parents for that to be a possibility. I began to understand that I had been assigned a role in the family system, the capable one, the independent one, the one who didn't need help or attention because I could handle everything myself. This role served the family's needs perfectly because it allowed them to focus all their emotional and financial resources on Dylan while still feeling good about themselves as parents. After all, they had raised one successful, self-sufficient child, which proved they were doing something right. After college, I landed an entry-level position as a junior developer at a tech startup in Austin called Innovate Tech Solutions. The salary was modest at $42,000 per year, but the city's energy, opportunities, and vibrant tech scene felt like exactly the fresh start I needed after years of grinding through school while watching my brother coast through life on our parents' dime. Austin in the early 2010s was exploding with growth, creativity, and possibility. The music scene was incredible, the food was amazing, and everywhere you looked, young professionals were building interesting companies and pursuing ambitious dreams. I shared a cramped 900-square-foot apartment with 2 roommates in a less-than-ideal part of town, splitting rent 3 ways to keep costs manageable. My portion of the rent was $480 per month, which left me with very little disposable income after student loan payments, groceries, and basic expenses. I survived on ramen noodles, free office snacks, leftover pizza from company meetings, and the occasional meal at food trucks when I could justify the expense. Every spare dollar went toward paying off my student loans as quickly as possible because I hated the feeling of debt hanging over my head. The work at Innovate Tech was challenging and rewarding in equal measure. I spent my days coding solutions for problems I found genuinely interesting and intellectually stimulating, learning from colleagues who shared my passion for innovation and problem solving. The company culture was collaborative and supportive, with senior developers who took time to mentor junior team members and help them grow their skills. I threw myself into the work with the same intensity I had brought to everything else in my life, staying late to debug complex issues, volunteering for challenging projects, and constantly learning new programming languages and frameworks. My dedication paid off relatively quickly. After 18 months, I earned a promotion to senior developer along with a salary increase to $58,000 per year. 6 months later, I was leading a small team on a major client project that earned company-wide recognition when we delivered ahead of schedule and under budget. By my 3rd year at the company, I was making $72,000 annually and being consulted on major architectural decisions for new products. While I was building my career and establishing my independence in Austin, Dylan returned home to Richardson to live with our parents after his eventual graduation from Henderson University. This living arrangement was supposed to be temporary according to everyone involved, just until he could get on his feet and figure out his next steps. That temporary arrangement stretched on for 2 full years, during which Dylan seemed to make no meaningful progress toward independence or self-sufficiency. During this extended period of post-college living with parents, Dylan cycled through a series of jobs that never seemed to meet his expectations, accommodate his creative spirit, or provide the intellectual stimulation he claimed to need. His first position was as a marketing assistant at a local insurance company, an entry-level role that paid $35,000 per year with full benefits and clear opportunities for advancement. Dylan lasted 4 months before quitting because, according to him, the corporate environment was stifling his individuality and the work was soul-crushing and beneath his educational background. His next attempt at employment was a position at a local non-profit organization focused on environmental conservation, work that he initially claimed was aligned with his values and meaningful in a way that corporate jobs could never be. This stint lasted exactly 6 weeks before Dylan declared that the work was emotionally draining, and that he couldn't handle being constantly exposed to depressing information about climate change and environmental destruction. He quit without giving notice, leaving his supervisor scrambling to cover his responsibilities during a critical grant application period. Dylan's most ambitious career attempt during this period was his decision to become a freelance graphic designer, a pursuit that our parents actively encouraged and financially supported. They paid for him to take online courses in design software, bought him a high-end computer and professional-grade monitor, and even helped him set up a home office in what had previously been our father's workshop. Dylan created business cards, built a website, and talked extensively about his vision for building a creative business that would allow him to work with clients who appreciated innovative design. In 8 months of freelance work, Dylan completed exactly 3 paid projects, all of which came through our father's business connections and involved creating simple flyers and brochures for local companies. The total income from these projects was less than $800, while our parents had invested several $1,000s in equipment, software, and training. When I gently suggested that he might want to supplement his freelance work with part-time employment to create a more stable income, Dylan responded with a lecture about how traditional employment kills creativity and how I didn't understand the artistic process. Each career setback and failure triggered extended family discussions about Dylan's potential and how to best support his journey of self-discovery. These conversations typically took place during my weekly phone calls with my mother, conversations that had become increasingly one-sided over the years. I was expected to listen sympathetically while she analyzed Dylan's latest employment disappointment, offered theories about why he was struggling to find his place in the world, and brainstormed new approaches to help him succeed. My own professional achievements during this same period were acknowledged with brief, perfunctory comments before the conversation inevitably pivoted back to Dylan's situation. When I called to tell my parents about my promotion to senior developer, my mother responded with, "That's nice, honey. I'm proud of you." Then immediately launched into a 20-minute analysis of why Dylan's graphic design business wasn't gaining traction and whether they should help him pursue additional training in web development. When I shared news about leading a successful project that had earned recognition from company leadership and positioned me for another promotion, my father's response was, "Good for you, son. We always knew you'd do well," followed immediately by a request for advice about whether they should help Dylan apply to graduate school programs in marketing since his freelance career wasn't providing enough income. The implicit message in these conversations was always the same. My success was expected and therefore unremarkable, while Dylan's struggles were tragic and required constant family attention and intervention. I had been so thoroughly trained to accept this dynamic that I rarely even felt hurt by it anymore. It was just the way our family operated, as natural and unchangeable as the weather. 3 years after moving to Austin, I had completely paid off my student loans and saved enough money for a down payment on a small house. The discipline required to accomplish this while living in an expensive city on a modest salary had been intense. I tracked every expense, cooked almost all my meals at home, drove a used Honda Civic that I maintained myself, and avoided expensive entertainment or travel. But the sacrifice felt worthwhile when I finally had $25,000 in my savings account and could start seriously house hunting. The house I eventually bought was a 1,200 square foot bungalow in the rapidly gentrifying area east of downtown Austin. Built in the 1940s, it needed significant work, but had incredible character and potential. Original hardwood floors ran throughout the main living areas, though they needed refinishing. The kitchen had vintage tile countertops that I planned to update gradually with my own labor. The single bathroom required complete renovation, and the backyard was overgrown, but offered plenty of space for gardening and outdoor entertaining. Every improvement I made to that house represented careful planning, weekend sweat equity, and the satisfaction of creating something beautiful with my own hands. I spent 6 months of evenings and Saturdays learning plumbing through YouTube videos and trial and error, completely gutting and renovating the bathroom. I refinished the hardwood floors myself, renting sanders and spending weeks on my hands and knees, applying stain and polyurethane. I built raised garden beds in the backyard and planted tomatoes, herbs and peppers that I tended carefully throughout the growing seasons. The kitchen renovation was my biggest project, taking nearly a year to complete, as I saved money for materials and learned new skills. I removed the old cabinets, updated the electrical and plumbing, installed new countertops, and painted every surface. The result was a bright, functional space that perfectly suited my needs and reflected my personal taste, rather than someone else's decisions about what I should want or need. That house became my sanctuary in ways I hadn't fully anticipated when I bought it. For the first time in my life, I had complete control over my environment and my space. No roommates leaving dishes in the sink or eating my food. No parents making decisions about how I should arrange my furniture or spend my time. No Dylan borrowing things without asking or appearing uninvited whenever he felt like it. I cultivated not just plants in my garden, but a sense of peace and satisfaction that came from creating something entirely my own. I adopted a rescue dog named Charlie, a medium-sized mixed breed, with intelligence, loyalty, and an excellent sense of character in the people we met. Charlie became my constant companion and the best judge of whether someone was trustworthy or had good intentions. I began hosting barbecues and dinner parties for co-workers and neighbors, slowly building a chosen family of people who appreciated my dry humor. my reliability, and my willingness to help others when they needed support. These friendships felt different from any relationships I had experienced growing up because they were based on mutual respect, shared interests, and genuine care for each other's well-being, rather than obligation, guilt, or family dynamics. But the peace and independence I had worked so hard to create didn't last as long as I had hoped. About a year after I bought the house, Dylan's living situation with our parents became increasingly untenable, according to my mother's more and more frequent phone calls. The official story was that Dylan needed more independence and space to fully develop as an adult and pursue his creative interests without the constraints of living in his childhood bedroom. The reality, which emerged through carefully worded conversations and reading between the lines of family updates, was that Dylan's prolonged presence at home had begun creating serious strain in my parents' marriage. At 25 years old, Dylan had no steady job, no car payment, since our parents still covered all his transportation costs, no rent or mortgage, no household responsibilities, and no apparent motivation to change his circumstances or work toward independence. His typical day involved sleeping until noon or later, playing video games for several hours, half-heartedly browsing job listings online, while complaining about the lack of opportunities that matched his interests and qualifications, and pursuing what he called passion projects that never produced income, demonstrable progress, or any concrete results. These passion projects included learning guitar, which lasted 3 weeks, writing a screenplay, which never progressed past the first 5 pages, starting a blog about sustainable living, which received 2 posts before being abandoned, and developing a business plan for an organic food truck, which never advanced beyond brainstorming sessions. The situation at home had devolved into daily conflicts about Dylan's lack of contribution to household tasks, his failure to actively seek employment, his tendency to leave messes for others to clean up, and his habit of making financial commitments on his parents' behalf without consulting them first. My mother found herself constantly mediating between my father's growing frustration and Dylan's defensive responses to any criticism or suggestions for change. The warning signs of what was coming began appearing during our weekly phone conversations, though I was initially too naive or optimistic to recognize them as the manipulation they actually were. My mother started asking seemingly innocent questions about my living situation, questions that seemed designed to gather information rather than express genuine interest in my well-being. "How's that big house of yours treating you?" she would ask with artificial lightness. "It must feel so empty with just you and Charlie rattling around in all that space. Don't you ever get lonely living by yourself?" Or from my father during our less frequent conversations, "Real estate values in East Austin are really shooting up, aren't they? You made a smart investment buying when you did, son. That place must be worth quite a bit more now than what you paid for it." These comments gradually escalated to more direct suggestions and observations about how much space I had and how that space might be utilized more efficiently or generously. "You know, Dylan has been talking more and more about moving to Austin," my mother mentioned during one call. "He thinks the creative scene there would be perfect for his artistic development, and there are so many more opportunities for young people with his background and interests." A few weeks later, the suggestions became even more explicit. "It would be so wonderful if you two could spend more time together as brothers. You're both adults now, and family relationships become so much more important as you get older. Dylan really looks up to you, you know. He's always talking about how successful and independent you've become." I should have recognized these conversations as the careful preparation for a larger request, but I was still operating under the assumption that my parents respected my autonomy and would ask permission before making decisions that affected my life. I was also genuinely busy with work and personal projects, which made it easier to dismiss these comments as casual conversation rather than strategic manipulation. The first actual boundary violation occurred when I returned from a work conference in San Francisco to find Dylan sitting comfortably on my living room couch, eating cereal from one of my bowls, watching my television, and acting as though his presence in my home was completely normal and expected. My initial reaction was confusion rather than anger. "Dylan, what are you doing here? How did you get in?" He looked up from his cereal with mild surprise, as though my question was unreasonable. "Oh, hey Marcus. Mom and Dad gave me your spare key. My car broke down yesterday, and I needed a place to crash for the night while they figured out the repairs. They said you wouldn't mind." The casual way he said, "They said you wouldn't mind," was my first clear indication that my parents had made decisions about my home and my hospitality without consulting me. But I was still trying to be understanding and accommodating, still operating under the family system that had trained me to prioritize Dylan's needs over my own comfort and boundaries. "Okay," I said slowly, "but you could have called to let me know you were coming over. And how long have you been here?" Dylan's response was evasive and defensive. "Just since yesterday afternoon. I kept everything clean, and I didn't touch any of your stuff. Well, except I used your computer for a little while to check my email, and I had someone over for dinner last night because I was feeling lonely and isolated, but we cleaned up afterward. As I looked around my living room and kitchen, the evidence of Dylan's keeping everything clean was obvious and contradicted his claims entirely. There were additional dishes in my sink that hadn't been there when I left. My coffee table had water rings and what appeared to be wine stains. My computer was still logged into accounts I didn't recognize. The furniture in my living room had been rearranged, and there were blankets and pillows on the couch that suggested he had been sleeping there rather than using the guest bedroom. When I confronted him about these discrepancies, Dylan's response was a masterclass in manipulation and deflection that I would come to recognize as his standard operating procedure whenever he was caught in lies or boundary violations. "I don't know what you're being so uptight about, bro," he said with a wounded expression that suggested I was the one behaving unreasonably. "It's not like you were even using the place while you were gone. I was just trying not to be a burden on anyone. I was in a really bad headspace about the car situation and my job search, and I just needed somewhere safe and quiet where I could think things through without Mom and Dad constantly asking me about my plans." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Dylan alternating between defensive justifications for his presence and emotional manipulation designed to make me feel guilty for questioning his behavior. He claimed that he had assumed I would want to help him during a difficult time. He suggested that my objections were evidence of how much success had changed me and made me less caring about family. He even implied that our parents were disappointed in my lack of generosity and family spirit. Eventually, I insisted that he return my spare key, but Dylan claimed he had already given it back to our parents and couldn't retrieve it until he got home. When I called to verify this story, my mother's response set the tone for every subsequent boundary violation and established the pattern of family-wide enabling that would make the situation progressively worse. "Oh, honey," she said with a dismissive laugh, "Dylan probably just forgot to mention returning the key. You know how scattered he gets when he's stressed about things like job hunting and car repairs. It's not a big deal. Can't you just make him a copy? It would be so convenient for family visits, and you know we would never abuse the privilege." The implicit assumptions in her response were staggering. First, that Dylan's stress justified his behavior, and my discomfort was irrelevant. Second, that my home should be available for family visits, regardless of my preferences or schedule. Third, that giving my family unrestricted access to my private space was reasonable and expected, rather than a significant violation of normal boundaries. But I was still trapped in the family system that had trained me to doubt my own reactions and prioritize everyone else's comfort over my own. So instead of standing firm and demanding my key back immediately, I agreed to make Dylan a copy for emergencies only, and tried to establish some basic ground rules about calling before coming over and not bringing other people to my house without permission. These rules were ignored almost immediately and consistently. Over the following months, Dylan's boundary violations intensified in both frequency and severity. He would appear at my house during my workdays, having been let in by neighbors who recognized him as my brother and assumed his presence was welcome. I would return home from the office to find clear evidence of his visits. Dishes in my sink that hadn't been there in the morning, my furniture rearranged to accommodate whatever activity he had been pursuing, my Netflix account logged into shows I had never watched, and my refrigerator lacking items that had been there when I left for work. The violations extended beyond simple use of my space and belongings. I discovered that Dylan had been using my home address to have packages delivered, items he had ordered online during his extended periods of unemployment when he had no income to pay for shipping to our parents' house. These packages included clothing, electronics, books, and even groceries, all charged to credit cards that our parents were apparently still funding, despite their claims that Dylan needed to become more independent. When I confronted Dylan about using my address without permission, his response followed the same pattern of defensive deflection that characterized all our interactions about his behavior. "I didn't think you'd mind," he said with wounded innocence. "It's not like the packages were bothering you or anything. The delivery guys just left them on your porch, and I picked them up when I came over. I was actually doing you a favor by making sure they didn't get stolen." My attempts to establish clearer rules and firmer boundaries were met with resistance, not just from Dylan, but from our parents, who seemed to view any limits I tried to set as evidence of selfishness and lack of family loyalty. When I told them that Dylan couldn't have unsupervised access to my home anymore, they responded with disappointment and lectures about the importance of sibling support during difficult times. "He looks up to you so much, Marcus," my mother would say during our increasingly strained phone conversations. "Can't you see how much it would mean to him to feel welcome in your space?" Family should be able to rely on each other, especially when someone is going through a rough patch like Dylan is right now. My father took a more direct and confrontational approach. Your brother is going through a difficult time, and family steps up during difficult times. That's just how things work. You have plenty of space, and it's not like he's asking you to support him financially or anything major like that. The irony of my father's comment about Dylan not asking for financial support was particularly galling, since our parents were still covering virtually all of Dylan's expenses, despite his age, and their stated goal of helping him become independent. But pointing out these contradictions only led to more lectures about family loyalty and suggestions that success was making me less compassionate toward people who were struggling. The situation reached what I thought was a breaking point during what became known in family conversations as the incident, though that term vastly understated the severity of what actually happened. I had planned a weekend camping trip with some friends from work, a rare opportunity to disconnect from technology, enjoy nature, and bond with colleagues outside the office environment. The trip was scheduled months in advance, and I had been looking forward to it as a chance to recharge and refresh after a particularly demanding project at work. I left Friday afternoon directly from the office, with my camping gear already packed in my car and everything at home secured and ready for my absence. I had specifically told Dylan during our most recent conversation that I would be out of town for the weekend and that my house would be empty, a detail I mentioned only because I was still naive enough to believe that information would discourage rather than encourage him to use my space without permission. When I returned Sunday evening, tired but relaxed from 2 days of hiking, fishing, and sleeping under the stars, I unlocked my front door, expecting to find everything exactly as I had left it. Instead, I walked into what looked like the aftermath of a small hurricane or a college fraternity party. The scene that greeted me was so shocking and violating that I literally stood in my doorway for several minutes, trying to process what I was seeing and understand how my carefully maintained home had been transformed into a disaster zone. Empty beer bottles and wine bottles covered every flat surface in my living room, kitchen, and dining area. Takeout containers spilled from my overflowing trash can, creating greasy stains on my kitchen floor. My sink was piled high with unwashed dishes, including plates and glasses I didn't recognize, suggesting that Dylan had not only used my kitchen extensively, but had also provided meals for multiple other people. The pile of dirty dishes was so large that food residue had begun to harden and develop what looked suspiciously like mold. My carefully arranged furniture had been pushed against the walls to create more open space, presumably for dancing or other party activities. Couch cushions were scattered across the floor. My coffee table was covered with water rings, food stains, and what appeared to be permanent marker, where someone had drawn pictures and written messages that I couldn't fully decipher. As I moved through the house in growing horror and disbelief, the violations multiplied and became more personal and invasive. In my bathroom, multiple damp towels lay scattered across the floor, none of them folded or hung properly. My expensive face creams, serums, and grooming products had been opened and used, with caps left off and contents significantly diminished. The guest bedding I kept neatly stored in my hallway closet was rumpled and dirty on my living room couch, along with several blankets I had never seen before. But the most painful and violating discovery waited in my bedroom, which should have been completely off limits to Dylan and his guests under any reasonable interpretation of appropriate behavior. My private journal, which I kept in the drawer of my bedside table and had never shared with anyone, lay open on my unmade bed with pages visibly turned and creased from extensive reading. This journal contained my most private thoughts, fears, and struggles. It included details about my therapy sessions, my efforts to understand and heal from our family's dysfunctional dynamics, my deepest insecurities about relationships and self-worth, and my honest feelings about Dylan and our parents. Seeing it displayed so casually, clearly read by people who had no right to access my private thoughts, felt like a violation that went far beyond mere property damage or inconsiderate behavior. Next to the journal sat a wine glass with a lipstick smudge that matched the shade Dylan's latest girlfriend typically wore, suggesting that not only had strangers been in my most private space, but that my personal thoughts and feelings had potentially been shared and discussed as entertainment by people I had never met. I called Dylan immediately, my hands actually shaking with a level of anger and betrayal that I rarely allowed myself to feel or express. The rage was so intense that I could barely form coherent sentences when he answered the phone with his usual casual, "Hey bro, how was your camping trip?" "My apartment," I managed to say through clenched teeth. "You had people in my apartment. You went through my personal belongings. You read my private journal. What the hell is wrong with you?" Dylan's response was so predictable and characteristic that it would have been almost comical if the situation hadn't been so serious and personally devastating. His tone immediately shifted from casual friendliness to defensive victimhood, employing every manipulation tactic he had perfected over years of avoiding consequences for his actions. "Oh, that," he said with forced lightness, as though we were discussing something trivial like forgetting to water my plants. "Yeah, I needed a break from my current living situation. My roommate has been being super annoying lately, bringing dates over and having loud conversations late at night and smoking inside the apartment even though it's supposed to be non-smoking. I just needed somewhere quiet and peaceful where I could relax and think about my future without all that negative energy around me." "A break?" I repeated, my voice rising to a level that was probably audible to other people in my neighborhood. "You threw a party in my house. You had strangers sleeping in my home. You read my private journal and left it open on my bed like it was casual reading material." "Okay, you're totally overreacting right now," Dylan replied with the condescending tone he used whenever he was caught in wrongdoing and needed to deflect blame onto the person confronting him. "It wasn't really a party. Just a few friends came over to hang out and maybe have a couple drinks, and we cleaned up afterward, mostly. It's not like we trashed the place or broke anything expensive." The blatant lies in the face of the disaster zone surrounding me fueled my anger even further. "You didn't clean anything. My house looks like a tornado hit it, and you had no right to go through my personal belongings, especially my journal. That's private, Dylan. That's my private thoughts and feelings that you had no business reading." His voice immediately shifted to the wounded, tearful tone that he employed whenever confronted with the consequences of his actions, a tone calculated to trigger guilt and sympathy from anyone who challenged his behavior. "Why are you yelling at me like this?" he asked with a tremor in his voice that suggested I was being cruel and unreasonable. I was going through a really difficult emotional time, and I just needed my big brother's support. I thought you would want to help me when I was struggling. I thought you would understand what it's like to feel isolated and overwhelmed. Before I could formulate a response that adequately conveyed my outrage without stooping to personal attacks, my phone beeped with an incoming call from our mother. The timing was so perfectly coordinated that I was momentarily impressed by the efficiency of their communication system, even as I was infuriated by the obvious manipulation. "Mom wants to talk to both of us," Dylan announced before I could decide whether to answer the call. "She says it's important that we resolve this as a family and not let it damage our relationship." I declined the call, but within minutes, Dylan informed me that our parents wanted both of us to come to dinner the following evening for what he described as an important family discussion about the situation. The assumption that I would participate in this family meeting, that I would subject myself to the familiar pattern of Dylan's behavior being excused and my reactions being criticized, triggered a level of clarity and determination that surprised me with its intensity. That night, sitting in my violated and chaotic home with Charlie pressed against my side as if he could sense my distress, I made a decision that would fundamentally change my relationship with my family and my approach to protecting my own well-being. I was done. Completely and permanently done with enabling Dylan's destructive behavior, accepting our parents' manipulation and emotional blackmail, and sacrificing my peace, privacy, and security for the illusion of family harmony. The emergency family dinner the following evening had all the theatrical elements of a carefully orchestrated intervention, except that I was positioned as the problem that needed to be addressed rather than Dylan, whose behavior had actually created the crisis. The setting was my parents' dining room, the same room where countless family discussions had resulted in Dylan's needs being prioritized and my objections being dismissed as selfishness or lack of family loyalty. The table was set with my mother's best china and cloth napkins, as though the formal presentation might lend weight and importance to whatever manipulative arguments they had prepared. The meal was pot roast with roasted potatoes, Dylan's favorite comfort food, and a choice clearly designed to create a warm, familial atmosphere that would make my anger seem inappropriate and excessive. My father cleared his throat multiple times throughout the appetizer course, a sure sign that he was preparing to deliver what he considered an important and authoritative statement about family responsibilities and proper behavior. My mother fluttered around the table, refilling water glasses that no one had touched, and adjusting serving dishes that were already perfectly arranged, her nervous energy indicating that she knew this conversation was going to be difficult and potentially explosive. After we had eaten in uncomfortable silence for about 15 minutes, my father put down his fork with deliberate precision and began what was clearly a prepared speech about Dylan's recent challenges and the family's collective responsibility to support him during this difficult transition period. "Your brother has had some significant setbacks recently," he began, speaking as though Dylan were not sitting directly across from me at the same table. "His living situation has become completely untenable, and he's struggling to find employment that matches his education and abilities in a very competitive job market. My mother immediately jumped in with supportive commentary, as though they had rehearsed this presentation. The rental market is just impossible for young people these days, and employers have such unrealistic expectations for entry-level positions. It's not like when we were starting our careers and you could walk into any office and get hired if you were willing to work hard. I remained silent, already recognizing the familiar pattern and waiting for them to arrive at the real purpose of this gathering. I knew they weren't simply seeking my sympathy or understanding of Dylan's situation, but were building toward a specific request that they assumed I would be unable to refuse. My father continued with his analysis of Dylan's circumstances, painting a picture of a young man struggling against forces beyond his control, rather than someone who had consistently made irresponsible choices and refused to accept the natural consequences of his actions. "The point is," he said with the authoritative tone he used when he wanted to end debate before it could begin, "your brother needs some temporary assistance while he gets back on his feet. We've always taught you boys that family helps family, and we know that you understand the importance of sibling loyalty and support." "Family helps family," my mother echoed, reaching across the table to squeeze Dylan's hand in a gesture of solidarity and support. "And we know you have that lovely house with plenty of space for someone to stay temporarily while they figure out their next steps." There it was, the request I had been anticipating since Dylan's first boundary violation months earlier. They weren't asking me to provide temporary accommodation. They were informing me that they had already decided Dylan would be moving into my home, and they expected my compliance with their decision. "Dylan was evicted," I stated flatly, cutting through their euphemistic language and forcing them to acknowledge the reality they were trying to obscure. "That's what this is really about, isn't it? He didn't pay his rent again, and now he needs somewhere to live because he can't afford his own place." My parents exchanged uncomfortable glances, and my mother's expression tightened into the thin-lipped look she wore whenever someone mentioned unpleasant truths that contradicted the narrative she preferred to maintain about our family's dynamics and Dylan's character. "It's not an eviction if someone chooses to leave voluntarily before the situation reaches that point," she said with defensive stiffness. "Dylan made a mature decision to end a lease that wasn't working out, rather than continuing to throw money away on a living situation that didn't meet his needs. We've been helping him with rent," my father added, confusion creeping into his voice for the first time during the conversation. "We gave him money for rent last month and the month before that. I don't understand why the landlord would have any issues with him." Dylan, who had been unusually quiet throughout his parents' presentation, suddenly became very interested in rearranging the food on his plate, rather than making eye contact with anyone else at the table. His body language and avoidance of the conversation suggested that there were aspects of his housing situation that he had